The marina had always been a quiet place. Early in the morning, the water reflected the soft colors of the rising sun, and the gentle waves lapped against the docks. People came there to fish, to sail, or just to breathe in the salty air. For many, it was a peaceful escape from the pressures of life, a place where the noise of the world seemed distant. The protagonist had always felt a strong connection to this place. There was something about the way the boats rocked gently in their slips, and the smell of the sea that brought calm and clarity. For years, the Homeowners Association had quietly started asserting control over the marina. At first, it was small things, like posting new rules on bulletin boards or asking for minor fees for maintenance. No one really thought much of it, and most residents followed along. It was easier to pay a little extra than to argue. But over time, the rules grew stricter and the fees grew higher. Some residents whispered that the HOA was overstepping its authority, but most people kept quiet. Nobody wanted to stir up trouble or be seen as confrontational. The protagonist noticed these changes with growing concern. They had always been observant, and it became clear that something didn't feel right. While the HOA insisted they had legal control over the marina, the documents didn't always add up. There were gaps, missing signatures, and inconsistencies in the paperwork that no one else seemed to notice or care about. The protagonist began quietly collecting records, old property deeds, and public documents to verify the HOA's claims. They wanted to be sure before saying anything. It wasn't about confrontation yet. It was about understanding the truth. In the evenings, after work, the protagonist would walk along the docks, clipboard in hand, checking details, making notes, and comparing them with official records at the county office. Each time, the unease grew. The HOA had convinced many residents that they had control, but the paper trail told a different story. The more the protagonist looked, the clearer it became that the HOA was possibly taking liberties that they were not legally entitled to. Still, they remained cautious. Confrontation without evidence could backfire. The community itself was a mix of personalities. Some people loved the rules, believing structure kept everything in order. Others quietly resented the fees and regulations but had accepted them as unavoidable. The protagonist, however, belonged to the group that valued fairness and the rights of the community. They had seen how people who challenge authority are often labeled troublemakers. But the protagonist wasn't interested in labels. They were interested in justice for everyone who used the marina. Residents often gathered near the main dock in the afternoons, exchanging stories about fishing, sailing mishaps, or local gossip. Conversations about the HOA were usually hushed, a quiet nod here or there about a new fee or an unfair rule. The protagonist listened carefully, learning about the frustrations people faced and the small injustices that seemed to go unnoticed. With each story, the sense of responsibility grew. The protagonist realized that this was bigger than themselves. It wasn't just about following the rules. It was about protecting a place that belonged to the community. One afternoon, the protagonist met an older resident who had been part of the community since the marina was first built. He had a wealth of knowledge about the property and its history. Over cups of coffee at the marina's small cafe, he shared stories about how the marina used to be fully open to residents, how boats were moored freely, and how decisions were once made collectively. The HOA has changed things, he said quietly. They make rules that feel official, but I've seen the records. I don't think they have the right to do half of what they say. That conversation sparked something in the protagonist. It wasn't anger, but a determination to dig deeper. If the older resident's memory was correct, then there were serious questions about the HOA's authority. The protagonist began planning a careful review of all the records, including those not easily accessible, like county deeds, permits, and historical ownership documents. This required time, patience, and a steady hand. There was no rush. The truth would reveal itself if they were meticulous. Days turned into weeks as the protagonist worked quietly, gathering information without drawing attention. They spent hours at the county office, scanning old deeds, tracing ownership lines, and making careful notes. Sometimes the work was tedious, and the stacks of paperwork seemed endless. But the protagonist found satisfaction in the process. Each piece of evidence brought a little more clarity and a little more understanding of the situation. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to act as if they had unquestioned authority. Notices were posted about fees, gates were closed without warning, and board members spoke with confidence at meetings. Many residents accepted it passively, paying fees or following new rules without question. The protagonists noticed the fear and hesitation in their neighbors, the way people avoided conflict even when they knew something felt wrong. This reinforced the need for careful, deliberate action. Impulsive confrontation could create chaos, but a well-prepared approach could change everything. The protagonist also began talking quietly with a few trusted neighbors, people who shared their concern. Together, they compared notes, shared documents, and discussed what could be done if the HOA's claims were indeed false. There was excitement in the group, tempered by caution. Everyone knew that legal battles could be complicated, and a public confrontation without solid evidence could backfire. But there was a shared sense of purpose. The marina belonged to the community, and someone had to stand up for that truth. As the weeks passed, the protagonist developed a clear understanding of the situation. The HOA's control was more about perception and fear than actual legal authority. Most residents didn't question the rules because they assumed the HOA was in charge. The protagonist realized that the key was not to fight blindly, but to expose the reality in a way that everyone could see. Without risking unnecessary conflict, evenings at the marina became a time for reflection. The protagonist would walk along the docks, thinking about the steps ahead, imagining how the confrontation would unfold when the truth was finally revealed. There was no rush, no desire for drama. It was about precision, about timing, and about protecting a community that had been quiet too long. Every wave against the dock reminded them of the calm before the storm, a quiet moment before decisive action. One day, while reviewing documents at home, the protagonist found a critical piece of evidence, an old deed that clearly outlined ownership boundaries, which the HOA had ignored. Holding the paper, a sense of clarity and purpose washed over them. This was the moment everything had been leading to. They weren't acting on impulse. They were acting on facts, evidence, and responsibility. The marina, this place of peace and community, deserved someone who would protect it. From that moment on, the protagonist began thinking in practical terms. How could the information be used without creating panic? How could the HOA's overreach be exposed to all residents in a fair, undeniable way? These questions shaped every action, every plan. The protagonist knew that careful planning and a steady approach would be essential. The marina was more than just property, it was a symbol of community. Protecting it required strategy, patience, and courage. Over time, the protagonist's quiet efforts began to have an effect. Some residents, noticing their diligence and attention to detail, began to listen more closely. Conversations about the HOA changed from whispers to questions. Do they really have the right to do this? People started paying attention, realizing that perhaps the rules they had accepted for years were not as solid as they had thought. The protagonist did not push anyone, but the truth started to spread. Quietly, naturally, undeniably. Through it all, the protagonist remained calm and patient. There was no need for confrontation yet. The first part of the journey was about understanding, about gathering evidence, and about preparing for a moment when the truth could not be ignored. The marina remained a place of calm beauty, even as tensions brewed quietly in the background. The protagonists walked the docks each day, feeling the sun on their face, listening to the waves, and knowing that soon, the community would see what they had always suspected: the HOA's control was not absolute, and the marina belonged to the people who loved it. The first part of the story was not about action. It was about awareness, preparation, and patience. The protagonist had planted the seeds of change, and the time would come when those seeds would grow. For now, the calm waters of the marina reflected not only the sky, but the steady determination of someone willing to do what was right. Even in the face of powerful opposition, every document reviewed, every conversation had, and every note taken was a step toward a future where fairness and truth would prevail. And as the sun set over the marina, casting golden light across the water, the protagonist knew that the journey had only just begun. Tensions at the marina began to rise slowly, almost imperceptibly, but the protagonist could feel the change in the air. The HOA had grown bolder, posting notices that demanded immediate compliance with new rules, some of which seemed arbitrary and unfair. Signs appeared at the dock about restricted hours, additional fees, and penalties for minor infractions. At first, people tried to ignore them, hoping the rules were temporary or that the HOA would reconsider. But over time, it became clear that the HOA intended to enforce them strictly, regardless of the fairness or legality of the actions. Residents started feeling frustrated. Quiet conversations in the Marina's cafe turned into heated debates. Some people grumbled about the fees and rules, while others worried about how to comply without losing access to the marina. It was a community that had once shared laughter and stories, now divided by fear and uncertainty. The protagonist observed it all carefully, noting the rising tension and the silent resignation in people's faces. They knew that the HOA's sense of authority depended on the community's acceptance. If the residents remained passive, the HOA could continue to expand its control unchecked. The protagonist began attending HOA meetings, not as an aggressor, but as an observer. The board members spoke confidently, using legal jargon and referencing vague policies to assert control. Whenever someone questioned their authority, the board would brush it off, claiming that the rules were standard or required for community safety. Many residents nodded in agreement, not out of understanding, but out of fear of confrontation. The protagonist quietly made notes, documenting every inconsistency, every unexplained decision. They knew that facts, not emotion, would ultimately make the difference. One evening, after a long day of research and observation, the protagonist sat at the dock, watching the sun sink into the horizon. The water reflected a fiery orange, and the gentle rocking of the boats offered a rare sense of calm. But the calm was deceptive. The HOA's actions were creating small fractures in the community. Friends who had once shared meals at the Marina's cafe now exchanged wary glances, hesitant to speak openly. The protagonist realized that if the HOA's power remained unchallenged, the community would continue to weaken, and the marina might lose its sense of unity forever. The protagonist decided to act cautiously. They began having private conversations with residents they trusted, people who had shown a quiet awareness of the HOA's overreach. In these discussions, the protagonist shared observations, asking if others had noticed similar inconsistencies. People began to open up, telling stories of unfair fees, denied access, and arbitrary punishments. The protagonist listened carefully, recording every detail. It wasn't about gossip or complaint. It was about understanding the full scope of the problem. Through these conversations, a clearer picture emerged. The HOA was exploiting the residents' lack of attention to legal documents and property boundaries. While they acted as if they owned the marina, the truth was murkier. Deeds and permits revealed that the HOA had limited authority, but they had managed to convince most people otherwise. The protagonist realized that if this information could be presented carefully, in a way that was undeniable, the community could reclaim control of the marina without unnecessary conflict. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to enforce new rules aggressively. One afternoon, a board member confronted a resident for docking a small boat without paying the newly imposed fee. The resident protested, insisting that the fee was unjustified, but the board member dismissed the argument and threatened to tow the boat. This incident caused a stir among other residents, some of whom had quietly accepted similar fines in the past. The protagonist took note of the event, recognizing it as an example of how the HOA used fear and intimidation to maintain control. The protagonist's observations were meticulous. Every notice posted, every fee enforced, every meeting attended was carefully recorded. They developed a system to track all HOA actions, comparing them against historical documents and legal records. It was painstaking work, but the protagonists believed that thoroughness would be their strongest tool. They also began to consider the timing of any confrontation. Acting too soon, without complete evidence, could backfire. The HOA was confident and organized, and a half-prepared challenge would likely be dismissed. Patience and precision were essential, in private. The protagonist reflected on the impact the HOA's overreach had on the community. People who had once loved the marina now approached it with caution. Families who had spent weekends by the water felt tension where there should have been relaxation. Children who once played freely along the docks were now watched more closely, as parents worried about rules and restrictions. The protagonists felt a growing responsibility, not only for themselves, but for the residents who relied on the marina for connection and joy. The stakes were higher than simple property rights. The marina was central to the community's spirit. Determined to act wisely, the protagonists began drafting a plan. They knew that presenting facts to the community and exposing the HOA's overreach needed careful coordination. One misstep could allow the board to dismiss the evidence or intimidate residents into silence. The protagonists considered the resources they had: historical documents, deeds, supportive neighbors, and a growing awareness among residents. The plan needed to balance clarity, legality, and timing, ensuring that the moment of confrontation would be undeniable as part of the preparation. The protagonists started educating themselves on legal procedures and property law. They met with a local attorney briefly, not to file a case yet, but to confirm that the approach they were considering was valid and safe. The advice confirmed their thinking. Patience and evidence would be crucial. Any hasty action could create unnecessary conflict, but a methodical approach grounded in law and facts would force recognition of the truth. Residents slowly began to notice the protagonists' diligence. Some approached with curiosity, asking questions about the documents, the history, and the legality of the HOA's actions. The protagonist answered carefully without revealing the full plan, but enough to encourage thoughtful discussion. People began to talk openly, asking questions about fees, rules, and ownership. Awareness was growing quietly, creating a foundation for change that was stronger than confrontation or anger. One particularly tense afternoon, disagreement erupted over access to a small dock area. A resident attempted to use a section that the HOA had recently restricted. The board insisted the resident pay an additional fee immediately. Voices were raised, accusations were exchanged, and frustration boiled over. The protagonist observed, noting every detail, knowing that this incident could be an example when presenting the evidence to the community. The key was to show patterns, not isolated events. To reveal the OS's consistent overreach. As the days passed, the protagonist continued to build quiet alliances. Trust formed among residents who had previously felt powerless. Conversations shifted from whispered complaints to shared observations, and people began to question assumptions. The protagonist encouraged this awareness subtly, never pushing, but guiding neighbors to consider the facts and the historical context. By empowering others to think critically, the protagonist ensured that any future action would have communal support, not just individual effort. The atmosphere at the marina became a delicate balance. The HOA continued to assert authority aggressively, while the community began to awaken to the truth. People watched each other and the board carefully, noticing inconsistencies and questioning rules that had once seemed unquestionable. The protagonist felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, knowing that their patience and careful planning were starting to bear fruit. Change was approaching, not through confrontation, but through awareness, clarity, and preparation. Evening walks along the docks became moments of reflection. The protagonist would watch the water ripple and boats sway gently, thinking about the next steps. Each wave seemed to remind them that timing was essential, that the right moment to act would present itself naturally. The calm before confrontation was a time to gather strength, to ensure that when the truth was revealed, it would be undeniable. The protagonist knew that preparation, patience, and careful observation were the foundation of success. By the end of this period, the protagonist had created a detailed record of HOA actions, legal documents, and community observations. They had built trust with residents, educated themselves on legal procedures, and planned the timing of future actions. The tension in the community had grown, but so had the awareness and readiness to act. The stage was set for the next phase, where careful planning and evidence would challenge the HOA's claims. The protagonist walked the marina each evening, feeling a mix of anticipation and calm, knowing that the moment of truth would soon arrive, and that the community they cared for would finally have the clarity and justice it deserved. The protagonist knew that simply observing the HOA and collecting documents was no longer enough. The signs of overreach were too frequent, and the residents' frustrations were growing. The next step required action, but it had to be planned carefully. Acting too soon could create unnecessary conflict, but waiting too long could allow the HOA to further entrench their control. Every detail mattered, from the timing of the move to the way residents would respond. Precision and patience had become the guiding principles. The plan began quietly behind the scenes. The protagonist revisited all documents, ensuring every deed, permit, and historical record was correctly filed and understood. They cross-referenced every claim the HOA had made against the official records. As they did this, they realized that the board's authority was even less than previously thought. The HOA had made subtle claims about ownership that were simply not supported by any legal documentation. This knowledge strengthened the protagonist's resolve. They now had undeniable proof that the marina belonged to the residents, not the board. At the same time, the protagonist continued building alliances with trusted neighbors. These were people who had already expressed concern about the UAC's actions and were willing to support a carefully planned response. Quiet meetings were held, often over coffee or during walks along the docks. In these conversations, the protagonist shared observations and encouraged residents to review historical records themselves. The more people understood the situation, the stronger the community became. They weren't being manipulated by fear or intimidation anymore. Awareness was becoming the first tool of change. The protagonist also considered how to communicate the evidence to the broader community. Simply presenting facts might not be enough. People needed to see patterns and trends, not isolated events. They began organizing the collected data into a clear and visual format that could be understood by everyone. Fees, restricted areas, and notices were all documented with dates, photographs, and official records. The goal was to show a consistent pattern of overreach, not just sporadic incidents. Every piece of evidence had to tell the story clearly and convincingly. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to act as though their authority was absolute. They posted new rules and fees almost weekly, each time assuming residents would comply without question. One afternoon, a board member attempted to block a resident from accessing a dock, citing a recently imposed fee. The resident refused to pay, insisting that the fee was unjustified. Voices were raised, and tension escalated quickly. The protagonist watched from a distance, noting the behavior and responses of both the board and the residents. This event, like others before it, became a key example of the HOA's overreach, showing how they used intimidation to maintain control. As the tension rose, the protagonist made careful preparations for the moment when action would be required. They checked the marina gates, ensuring they were functioning properly. They thought about how to present documents in a clear and undeniable way. They also considered timing, choosing a moment when the HOA board would be present but unable to argue their way out of the evidence. This required meticulous planning and foresight. But the protagonist knew that careful preparation would make all the difference. Late evenings were often spent walking the docks alone, reviewing notes and imagining possible scenarios. The calm water reflected the night sky, creating an almost surreal sense of peace, but beneath it lay growing anticipation. The protagonist reflected on the community's feelings, the frustration, the fear, and the desire for fairness. Every step taken, every document reviewed, and every conversation held was preparing for a moment that could change the community forever. The stakes were high, but the protagonist's focus never wavered. During this period, the protagonist also reached out to a few legal experts quietly, confirming the strength of their evidence and ensuring that any actions would be within legal boundaries. It was important to avoid confrontation that could be dismissed on technicalities. They wanted to act decisively, but lawfully. These consultations provided reassurance that the approach being planned would withstand scrutiny and could not be easily dismissed by the board. The protagonist also began preparing neighbors for what was to come. Without revealing the exact timing or actions, they encouraged awareness, urging residents to observe the rules, notice inconsistencies, and keep records. People started paying attention in ways they hadn't before. Where there had once been quiet acceptance, there was now cautious observation. Conversations shifted from fear to curiosity and critical thinking. Residents were beginning to see the patterns that the protagonist had been documenting for months. One afternoon, the protagonist noticed a small act that highlighted the HOF's overreach in a way that words alone could not. A new sign had been posted, restricting access to a section of the marina that had historically been open to everyone. A resident, unaware of the recent rule, walked past the sign and was immediately stopped by a board member. The confrontation was brief but tense, leaving the resident confused and frustrated. The protagonist took photographs, noting the date, the exact wording of the sign, and the response of both parties. It was another clear example of arbitrary control, and it would be included in the presentation of evidence as the protagonist continued there. Careful observation and documentation. They also refined their communication strategy. They knew that when the moment arrived, it would be important to speak clearly and calmly. Emotions could cloud judgment, and the goal was not to attack but to reveal the truth. They practiced explanations, visual presentations, and methods for demonstrating ownership without confrontation. Every detail was considered, from how documents were displayed to how questions from residents and board members might be addressed. The protagonist's efforts were starting to influence the community. Neighbors who had previously accepted the HOA's authority without question began to ask more pointed questions. Some reviewed documents themselves, confirming inconsistencies. Others spoke quietly with friends, sharing concerns and observations. The community was waking up, slowly but steadily, to the reality that the marina might not be under the board's absolute control. Awareness was growing, laying the groundwork for a moment when action would be undeniable. Throughout this period, the protagonist remained careful not to rush or force events. Timing was crucial. They watched the flow of activity at the marina, noting patterns in board meetings, resident gatherings, and daily use of the docks. Every detail contributed to a strategy that would be precise and effective. The protagonist understood that success depended not on confrontation or anger, but on presenting facts in a way that could not be ignored or disputed. Late nights were often spent reflecting on the larger significance of the marina. It was more than just a property. It was a gathering place, a source of joy, and a symbol of community. The protagonist considered how the HOA's overreach had affected families, children, and longtime residents. This reinforced the importance of careful action. The marina was worth defending, not through aggression, but through preparation, evidence, and community awareness. Protecting it meant ensuring that every resident could continue to enjoy the space freely and fairly. The protagonist also considered possible obstacles. The HOA could resist, attempt to discredit evidence, or intimidate residents. These possibilities were carefully evaluated, and contingency plans were developed. The protagonist prepared for questions, objections, and attempts to delay or confuse. Each scenario was imagined and addressed, ensuring that when the decisive moment arrived, nothing could undermine the clarity of the truth. By the end of this period, the protagonist had transformed from an observer into a strategist. Every document, every conversation, and every observation had built a foundation for action. The community was becoming aware, residents were questioning assumptions, and the HOA's authority was increasingly scrutinized. The stage was set for a turning point. The protagonist knew that the next steps would require courage, precision, and calm execution. The marina, once a place of quiet enjoyment, was about to become the center of a significant moment of justice and clarity. The calm evenings at the marina were now tinged with anticipation. The protagonist walked the docks, reviewing plans and visualizing how the evidence would be presented. Every wave against the dock, every reflection of the sun on the water, reminded them that patience and preparation were essential. The residents were awakening, and the HOA's confidence was starting to show cracks. The protagonist understood that timing, evidence, and clarity would be the keys to success. When the moment arrived, the truth would be undeniable, and the community would see. What had been hidden in plain sight for years, The day had come when the protagonists knew that preparation alone would not be enough. The moment to act had arrived, carefully planned but tense with uncertainty. Early that morning, the marina was calm. The sunlight danced on the water, reflecting the soft movement of boats as if nothing unusual were about to happen. The protagonist walked the docks, clipboard in hand, checking that everything was in order. The gates were ready, documents organized. Supportive neighbors were quietly waiting, aware of their role without knowing all the details. It was a delicate balance of timing, trust, and precision. The HOA board members arrived mid-morning, unaware of what was about to unfold. They moved confidently, expecting their usual, unquestioned authority to prevail. Notices were posted, fees calculated, and the usual tone of command was present in their voices. The protagonist observed quietly, noting each action, each word, understanding that these moments would soon be contrasted with undeniable facts. Every step the board took was carefully cataloged, creating a clear record of behavior that would reinforce the evidence already collected. Then, in a calm and deliberate motion, the protagonist locked the gate. It was not done with aggression or drama, but with quiet certainty. The action was simple, yet it sent a ripple of confusion through the board members. They approached, demanding explanations, their confident demeanor beginning to show cracks. The protagonist met them calmly, holding up the organized documents that outlined the marina's legal ownership and historical records. The board members' claims, once unquestioned, were now confronted with irrefutable evidence. Residents began to gather naturally, drawn by curiosity and a sense of something significant unfolding. The protagonist explained, in clear and simple terms, the facts that had been quietly collected over months. Fees that had been imposed without proper authority, restrictions that were arbitrary, and claims of ownership that were unsupported by legal documents were all presented. There was no shouting, no personal attack, just a calm presentation of facts that could not be disputed. The clarity of the information created a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The board members tried to respond, attempting to use familiar tactics of intimidation and authority. They spoke loudly, referenced vague policies, and tried to assert their control. But each attempt was met with clear evidence, every claim countered by documents, photographs, and historical records. Residents watched, beginning to understand that the power they had once assumed belonged to the HOA was actually based on perception and fear. The protagonist's calm demeanor, backed by undeniable facts, was breaking down the board's control without confrontation. As the minutes passed, tension grew, but remained controlled. The protagonist addressed questions from residents, showing them how to read the documents and understand the discrepancies. People were engaged, asking questions, confirming details, and realizing the truth for themselves. There was a sense of empowerment spreading through the crowd. The marina, once a place of passive obedience to an unseen authority, was becoming a community that understood its rights and responsibilities. Some board members attempted to shift the narrative, claiming that the rules had been necessary for safety or maintenance. The protagonist calmly presented evidence of past practices, showing that the community had long maintained the marina without the need for arbitrary rules or fees. Residents began to nod, recognizing the truth in the statements. The weight of historical practice and documented ownership was undeniable, and the board's attempts to assert authority were failing in real time. Throughout this confrontation, the protagonist remained focused on the larger goal, protecting the community and the marina. The actions were not personal, and there was no desire to humiliate anyone. The emphasis was on clarity, fairness, and transparency. Every piece of evidence, every explanation, was directed toward empowering residents and ensuring that the HOA's overreach could not continue. The calm, methodical approach prevented escalation and kept the focus on facts rather than emotion. By midday, the situation had transformed. Residents were fully aware of the inconsistencies and overreach, and the board members were visibly unsettled. Some attempted to argue, but the calm, organized presentation of evidence left little room for dispute. It was a moment of clarity that few could ignore. The community had been shown the truth, not through confrontation or anger, but through careful preparation and the deliberate, unveiling of facts, the protagonist then guided the residents through a review of all relevant documents, pointing out patterns of behavior and specific examples of the HOA's overreach. Each document told part of the story, and together they formed a complete picture. Residents were engaged, asking questions and verifying details. It was a communal realization, a collective understanding of the situation that empowered everyone present. The protagonist watched as people absorbed the information, realizing that their quiet patience and preparation had made this moment possible. During this process, the protagonist also emphasized the importance of unity. The community's power lay not in confrontation, but in understanding and collective recognition of rights. They encouraged residents to continue documenting activities, to remain vigilant, and to work together to ensure fairness. The focus was on long-term protection of the marina, creating a culture of awareness that could prevent future overreach. Residents were inspired, feeling a renewed sense of control and responsibility. The board members, confronted with undeniable facts and a united community, had little choice but to acknowledge the situation. Some were defensive, others confused, but the clarity of evidence was overwhelming. The protagonist facilitated a calm discussion, ensuring that legal and historical documents were reviewed and understood. This transparency removed the room for manipulation or dismissal. Leaving the board with no plausible claim to unchecked authority, residents began to voice their support for community oversight of the marina, asking questions about how to maintain fair rules and ensure accessibility for everyone. The protagonist guided these discussions, emphasizing collective decision-making and respect for historical practices. The atmosphere shifted from tension to collaboration. The community began to imagine a marina governed by shared responsibility rather than arbitrary control. The balance of power was restored, not through conflict, but through awareness, evidence, and careful planning. By late afternoon, the immediate confrontation had resolved, and the community had a clear understanding of the marina's legal status and the limits of the HOA's authority. The protagonist ensured that documents were accessible, that residents knew their rights, that a plan was in place to maintain oversight collectively. The board members, while unsettled, could no longer assert arbitrary control. The community had seen the truth and understood its importance. The calm, methodical approach had turned the tide without resorting to anger or aggression as the sun began to set. The protagonist walked the docks, reflecting on the day's events. The water glowed with golden light, and the boat swayed gently. The tension that had been building for months had dissipated, replaced by a sense of calm empowerment. Residents lingered, talking quietly, reviewing documents, and sharing their observations. The protagonist felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that careful planning, patience, and respect for truth had achieved what anger or confrontation could not. The gates remained locked, but now they symbolized more than restriction. They represented clarity, legal authority, and communal understanding. Residents knew that the marina belonged to the community and that their rights were protected. The protagonist had transformed a place of quiet submission into a space of awareness, collaboration, and empowerment. The day had been a turning point, not just in terms of control over property, but in the sense of unity and responsibility that now flowed through the community. Even as the evening settled, the protagonist continued to observe and guide. Conversations about fair use, community oversight, and the history of the marina continued. The board members were no longer dictating terms, but listening, adapting, and in some cases, learning from the residents. The protagonist had shown that careful preparation, clear evidence, and calm execution could overcome fear, intimidation, and false authority. The community was stronger, more aware, and ready to protect its shared space for the future. The events of the day were not dramatic or violent, but their impact was profound. The HOA's overreach had been exposed, residents had gained understanding and confidence, and the marina had been restored to a place of fairness and community. The protagonist walked the docks one last time that evening, feeling the cool breeze, listening to the gentle lapping of the water, and knowing that months of preparation, patience, and careful observation had culminated in a moment that would be remembered. The calm before the storm had given way to clarity, empowerment, and a renewed sense of community at the marina. After the decisive day at the marina, life began to shift in ways that the protagonist had quietly hoped for, but not fully imagined. The community, once quiet and hesitant, now carried a new energy. People moved along the docks with a sense of purpose, speaking openly with neighbors, sharing experiences, and celebrating the clarity that had been achieved. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and residents were finally seeing the marina as a shared space that belonged to them all. The protagonist watched these changes with satisfaction, knowing that the months of careful planning, observation, and preparation had not only addressed the HOA's overreach, but it also strengthened the sense of community. The board members, initially stunned by the confrontation, began to accept that their claims of authority were no longer unquestioned. Some were defensive, some withdrawn, but all had to recognize the evidence and the collective awareness of the residents. Over time, the board shifted from a position of unilateral control to one where decisions were discussed openly and fairly. It was a slow process, but the change was visible. Residents were encouraged to participate, ask questions, even propose ideas for the maintenance and management of the marina. The protagonist's goal had never been to humiliate anyone, but to create a system of fairness and collaboration. As the weeks passed, the community implemented new practices that reflected this change. Meetings were held where residents could voice concerns, suggest improvements, and vote on actions related to the marina. Rules were reviewed and simplified, with clear explanations of why each rule existed and how it affected the community. Fees that had been arbitrary or unjust were removed or adjusted fairly. The docks, once a place of quiet compliance and tension, became lively again, with people enjoying the space freely and responsibly. The protagonist continued to be involved, not as a ruler or enforcer, but as a guide and facilitator, ensuring that the spirit of fairness remained intact. One of the most significant changes was the renewed sense of ownership among residents. Families who had once hesitated to use the marina now spent entire weekends there, enjoying fishing, sailing, or simply walking along the docks. Children played freely and neighbors gathered without fear of arbitrary rules or unexpected fees. The marina had become a symbol of collective responsibility and shared joy. The protagonist felt a deep satisfaction in seeing this transformation. It was proof that careful planning, patience, and clarity could restore balance and foster trust within a community. Asterisk.